Once again, Shabbat Shalom. I now have the pleasure of saying a few nice words about a dear friend of mine, Uri Feinberg. Many of you remember that in 2011, only a handful of weeks after I was named the incoming senior rabbi of Westchester Reformed Temple, I went outside and slipped on a patch of black ice and badly broke my right ankle and was immobilized for the next 8 weeks. This just before I was supposed to lead a big temple trip to Israel. And I realized before long that there was no way I was going to be hobbling along leading 60 Jews in Jerusalem for 10 days. So I strategized with Rabbi Rick Jacobs, and he said, I think here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask for our associate rabbi, also cantor, we called him Crabbi, Dan Sklar, to lead the trip as our clergy representative, and then we're going to get the Michael Jordan of guides. We're going to get the greatest guide who has ever guided Jews throughout Israel, and non-Jews too. His name's Uri Feinberg. And I said, that name rings a bell. Is he related to Rabbi Shaul Feinberg, who was the Dean of Students for the Hebrew Union College Israel program, my first year in rabbinical school back in 1995? He said, one and the same. And how many of you were on that trip? Good, I was on a different kind of trip. And of course, out of such beginnings, deep and lasting relationships are made and sustained. Uri led our trip in 2011, I think again in 2013, 2016, 2019 with Rabbi Reiser, and as recently as this past March on our Solidarity mission with Cantor Kleinman. How many in the room tonight have ever traveled to Israel and been guided and taught and inspired by Uri Feinberg? So how wonderful that you're here tonight. And the rest of us who are here for whatever brought us, because we love Shabbat, because we love our family, because we need to pray for healing, because we want to celebrate life's abundance, because we want to mourn life's sadness, you're in for a treat tonight. Uri Feinberg has been a Jewish educator and a guide for 25 years. He was born in the U.S. He can't fool you with that accent. Uri emigrated to Israel when he was 10 years old, grew up in Jerusalem, served in the IDF, and then traveled the world. He has a master's degree from the Hebrew University in Contemporary Jewish Studies and was a Jewish history teacher for North American teens who were studying in semester abroad programs in Israel for many years. He then spent 3 years in the U.S., in the Boston area, I think, with his wife and 3 daughters. I just saw Meryl, his wonderful wife, at the airport last night. There at Temple Israel in Boston, he was interim director of education. He has also worked as a tour educator for the UJA Federation of New York, many federations around the country, synagogue groups, and is really the in-house top guide for the Reform movement, for the Union for Reform Judaism and the Central Conference of American Rabbis. He leads tours for families, interfaith groups, multi-generational, special study tours. You'll want to travel to Israel with Uri. He has also guided Jewish heritage trips throughout Europe and lectured on Israel and Jewish identity across North America. Since October 7th, Uri has joined Israeli civil society, helping wherever he can. He has also reharnessed the tools of his trade to partner with and help the North American Jewish community grapple with and strengthen their knowledge of what has happened, how the effect of October 7th continues to reverberate throughout Israel, and why we feel the way we feel, which will be at the heart of tonight's conversation. He's done this in person, through Zoom and remote teaching. He and his family live in the growing city of Modi'in and are active members of one of WRT's beautiful sister congregations, Ki'ilat Yozma. His experience has been driven by his desire to share the power and beauty and meaning of the land and state of Israel, to strengthen Jewish identity and a global connection among the Jewish people. I'm so happy, Uri Feinberg, that you're with us tonight. Welcome. By the way, for those of you who have traveled with Uri, he recognizes all of your faces, and he knows all of your names. But just in case the jet lag has gotten to him tonight, if you converse with him at the oneg or after services tonight, please reintroduce yourself by name.
In 2011, I didn't need these. When I was much younger, I found myself at a difficult juncture about a year into my military service. I was dropped from the unit in which I was serving. I'd initially tried out to test myself to see if I could finish the so-called Hell Week. To my surprise, I not only finished what was the most difficult week of my life, but I was accepted along with a handful of hopefuls from amongst hundreds of high school graduates. What followed was a year of grueling sweat and tears. In the second and final cut, I was dropped from the unit because I simply wasn't good enough. Those last few words didn't always roll off my tongue so easily. That moment was the definitive pitfall of my life. While I could have stayed in the unit in a non-combat role, I chose to move over to the paratroopers, where I marched in many miles and climbed many mountains. I completed a combat medics course, which led me to a first job out of the Army as a traveling medic with the nifty teen trips that came to Israel for the summer. Soon enough, the youth movement asked me to be a guide for their summer trips and then to teach Jewish history in their semester program. I met a particular counselor leading the Eisner camp bus, who later became my wife. And, well, the rest is history. I'm not sure how much time passed or how much ground I had covered, but when I had a moment to reflect, to identify certain junctures and hurdles that led to immense clarity, it happened at some point along the way. My family, my profession, and my calling were born from within that same pit of despair that sent me into a tailspin. Till today, when our kids face adversity of some kind, I remind them of the story when I was around your age and I was kicked out and I wasn't good enough, and yes, Dad, we know that's how you met Mom. Shabbat Shalom. My name is Uri, you heard, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here this evening. I've known Rabbi Blake and have been a friend of Westchester Reformed Temple, as you've heard, for many years. Along with his wife Kelly, we have led several trips together, and I've had the pleasure of traveling with other WRT clergy throughout Israel and have visited your beautiful congregation several times. While I'm far from home, it doesn't feel that way, because even though I'm used to seeing the rabbis, Cantor Kleinman, and members of this wonderful community on a bus traveling throughout a pre- and post-October 7th Israel, this heading has very familiar faces, which makes me feel very welcomed. My family and I made Aliyah. We moved to Israel when I was 10 years old, and I grew up in Jerusalem. Following the Army, as you heard in the introduction, I traveled the world, like many of us do post-Army, to stretch our legs a bit, before we return home and try and figure things out. I quickly found myself in the world of education, and whether as a guide in the field or a teacher in the classroom, have been a Jewish educator for 25, 30 years now. Most importantly, though, I am married to Meryl, that same counselor from Brooklyn. And we have 3 daughters, Meitav, who is 24, Shira, 21, and Adi is 17. I share all of this with you because what drives me in general, and specifically at these very challenging days, is my family, my personal one and my communal one, my Israeli one and my Jewish one. This week's Torah portion of Vayera finds us on a journey that began last week with its first step into the unknown. We met those who would lead us. We learned of their fortitude and their failings, have seen their compassion and their jealousy, and coincidentally, at the end of this week's Torah portion, we bear witness to what could have been a climactic supernova, ready to engulf the multitude of stars in the heavens intended to be our lot. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering, Isaac asks. Never had our salvation been so needed and so blatantly absent on that final trek up the hill. Blind faith seemed to be the answer. God will provide. Maybe faith is needed. Maybe that journey up Mount Moriah was the time we needed to contemplate that faith. Had this watershed moment gone any other way, we probably wouldn't have any other Torah portions to contemplate. Fortunately, it is rarely about what we bring to the mountaintop, rather what we carry with us on our return. This baggage, as it were, often comes with its appropriate layers of complexity. Chaim Guri, Israeli poet of our 1948 Palmach generation, whose pen was even more powerful than his sword, concludes his powerful poem, Yerusha, Inheritance, describing the very events we read this week. The child freed of his bonds saw his father's back. Yitzchak, it is said, was not offered as a sacrifice. He lived a very long time, seeing the good until the light of his eyes dimmed. But he bequeathed that hour to his descendants. They were born with a knife in their heart. Could it be that we are where we are because we are destined to carry this knife within us? Is that what we carried off of the mountain? The past 406 days have caused us to plummet through a painful and constant reminder of where we have been and what we continue to endure. We mark each day knowingly, demanding of ourselves never to forget, not to forget who we are and who we aspire to be. A marker of days on a piece of tape on our chest, a dog tag around our neck, or simply the pursed lips of a face encountered, mirrored in ours, silent and in pain, that shares our most recent tragic communal memory. This passive glance occurs even as we have actively had to share with parents and grandparents about their children and their grandchildren, how they were killed, when, where, and why. We have had to share with our collective children the memory of those who fell, those who were murdered. We as a people are no stranger to teaching our children about where we come from, repeating this lesson again and again. Just weeks ago, that watershed moment of completion, followed by renewal and rebirth, will forever be different. That yearly turning point that has always allowed us to reclaim our narrative with new eyes, new experiences, and new perspective will no longer solely be about harvest, celebration, and the memory of our journey. Simchat Torah 5784, the first annual marker of a world before and a world after, became a holiday of collapse, of pain, and of sorrow. It wasn't about our joy carrying the Torah scroll or growth alone, but about our tears and carrying the memory of our loved ones and of our nation that was. How are we to come down that mountain? Do we have any choice? Do we have the ability to take action and rid ourselves of that knife? At 6:29 on October 7th, 2023, so much more than that multi-million-dollar fence collapsed. Our sense of self, our sense of security and clarity into who we are and what we stand for, as well as the very essence of what it means to be an Israeli, all disintegrated as the first pickup trucks, motorcycles, hang gliders came across our borders in the western Negev. I'm sure you remember where you were when you heard. You may have even been in this beautiful space. We all remember. It will be forever etched in our minds and in our hearts. This is not the first time that Israel has faced challenge, adversity. It's not even the first time that Israel has faced a surprise attack. 50 years and almost to the day since Egypt and Syria attacked on another fateful holiday. But this attack, this moment, unfolded into an unprecedented experience, one that left us gasping for air and grasping to our past for any lifeline of how to respond. Sadly, there's no manual to draw from. We have not been here before. This has not happened to us before, and no one has done this to us before. 1,200 women, men, children murdered and killed on that fateful Shabbat, civilians and soldiers, 251 stolen from their beds, their homes, their fields, and their bases. The physical and sexual abuse and mutilation, the sheer magnitude of horror, as you know, was reminiscent of nothing. Just like that, we found ourselves fighting for our lives. It's been a while since Israel has faced an existential war, a war of no other choice. Our front line with Gaza and Hamas immediately expanded to multiple front lines surrounding Israel, including countries with whom we do not share a border, that are thousands of kilometers away and continues through today. The truth is that each individual and each family in Israel is a front line unto themselves for 13 months and counting. We each have someone, we are each going through something, and somehow we are trying to get through another day. Thank God, my immediate circle has been safe. Our oldest finished her military service in a combat unit a few years ago, traveled to South America for her own walkabout, was in the final stages of preparing to start university when the war broke out, and subsequently spent more than 200 days in reserve duty down south with her Iron Dome unit. Our middle daughter, Shira, who served in the same unit, spent the entirety of the war since October 7th up north in the Golan Heights in the Galilee, where she and her friends were quite busy. It's always pretty astounding to me how this young person is tasked with protecting Israel from incoming projectiles, and yet at times can't pick up her socks from the floor of her room. I guess that's her safe space, and better she forget to do something at home than when she's busy at work. While they would rather be doing something else than their military service, they were both willing and ready to protect their country. I do my best to keep my pride contained, but sometimes it slips out. We also have young cousins in Gaza, nephews in Lebanon, friends and children of friends who are all on a front line somewhere. We have all been to shivas and funerals. We have all stood at attention alongside the roads with Israeli flags as honor guards for funeral processions, as families pass through old stomping grounds and stepping stones of their children who they will soon bury. The multiple age groups affected by the multiple simultaneous funerals around the country forces the grim reality that we are facing a different monster, literally and figuratively. These funerals of soldiers and civilians, of bodies of hostages recovered, and of those murdered on the 7th continue through today. Whether subconsciously or consciously, we listen in dread for a knock on the door, a phone call, or knowing a name that is mentioned on the radio with the prelude, the following name has been cleared to announce. With these words, a collective stolen breath is taken throughout the country, and there are, of course, names that we all know. Names of faces we have all seen. Names that have been on our lips as we have prayed for their safe return. Names we have cried out in joy 8 separate times when we learned of their heroic rescue. And too many times, those names were cried out in pain as their recovered bodies were brought home for burial. For the first part of the war, I drove around the country from the Lebanese border in the north down towards Gaza and the farthest reaches of the Negev in the south, to drop off boxes at bases and outposts with whatever could be helpful for soldiers. This was done altruistically for true love and admiration of our soldiers, but also selfishly because I felt as if I had to do something. This, however, is absolutely not about me. I am one of hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have done anything and everything they can. The synagogue I belong to in Modi'in, where I live, Keilat Yozma, like so many other places within Israel's civil society, mobilized to set up a command center of volunteers, donating, purchasing, boxing, driving. This civil society has been a shining light within so much darkness. There was so much we did not recognize when we were faced with the worst day to befall the Jewish people since the Holocaust. As I mentioned, everything we thought to be true about ourselves and the world around us seemed to dissipate before our eyes. The one thing that we recognized and even anticipated was our resilience. Our very identity as Israeli has been molded by our particular experience, forged on the backdrop of our beautiful rolling green Galilee mountains, the powerful silence of the Negev, the historic alleyways of the old city in Jerusalem, and the old, new, pioneering spirit bequeathed by the founders of Tel Aviv. Our ability, however, as a people, to find resolve, continue forward, adapt in order to survive, find strength in the face of adversity, and to make the choice again and again to rise up after every destruction, desecration, and expulsion has evolved over thousands of years along the entire trajectory of our collective memory. This resilience manifested itself in multiple ways. We saw this with 120% show up to 100% call up of the reserves. Those who were called came, and many of those who weren't called came. This happened because there was a real sense that our defense and our survival depended on me. We have always been taught we each have to see ourselves as if we left Egypt. Well, that moment was now. There were those of us who drove down into the line of fire to do something, save someone. There were retired generals like Noam Tibon and his wife Gali, who drove to save their children and grandchildren, saving many along the way. There were farmers such as Rami Davidyan, disregarding his own safety and saved hundreds. Resilience is Tali Haddad from the town of Ofakim, whose son Itamar was home on leave, who ran down to the street to fight off the terrorists with his mother in tow. Itamar was badly injured, pulled to some kind of cover. His mother shows up and tells him to hold tight. I'm getting the car. She drives him out of the line of fire, out of Ofakim, to the medical teams who couldn't enter, and then she drives in 3 more times under fire to save as many as she could. Resilience are protest movements born in the streets earlier in 2023, voicing defiance against the judicial reform, with grassroots collectives such as Achim LaNeshek, Brothers and Sisters in Arms, which found itself at the center of these protests, turning on a dime on October 7th, beginning what would become the largest civil society movement focused solely on saving Israel and Israelis, driving those out of the line of fire, securing shelter for those who were evacuated, organizing assistance for farmers, collecting anything and everything needed by the survivors and the evacuees from the north and from the south, and much more. They continue orchestrating these collective measures through today. Resilience within Israeli society included all of those families who were left behind when 300,000 reservists were called up, with both men and women called to don the uniform again and again and again. It was mostly mothers who were left behind for months and now a year on end to protect and secure their children and their family on the home front, no less a front line. The resilient task of holding a family together from the inside to keep it from disintegrating can be found amongst all of the displaced families who have been living away from their homes, from their safe space, not knowing when they will return. Resilience also sounds like the voice heard in the following message sent by Iris Chaim, mother of 28-year-old Yotam Chaim, who was stolen from his home on Kibbutz Kfar Aza by Hamas. Yotam, along with 2 other hostages, Samar Talalka and Alon Shimris, managed to escape their captors and woefully were misidentified by Israeli troops when they were accidentally killed on December 15th. She shares the following message in Hebrew with subtitles with the soldiers who accidentally killed her son.
שלום לחטיבה 7828 ביסלח, גדוד 17, מדברת איריס חיים. אני אימא של יותם. אני רציתי להגיד לכם שאני מאוד אוהבת אתכם, ושאני מחבקת אתכם פה מרחוק, ואני יודעת שכל מה שקרה זה בכלל לא באשמתכם, ובאשמת אף אחד חוץ מהחמאס, יימח שמם וזכרם על פני האדמה. אני מבקשת לשמור על עצמכם, ולחשוב כל הזמן שאתם עושים את הדבר הכי טוב בעולם שיכול לקרות, שיכול לעזור לנו כעם ישראל, וכולנו זקוקים לכם בריאים, ואל תהססו לרגע אחד. אם אתם רואים מחבל, אל תחשבו שאתם הרגתם חטוף בכוונה, אתם צריכים להגן על עצמכם, כי רק ככה אתם תוכלו לשמור עלינו. ובהזדמנות הראשונה אתם מוזמנים לבוא אלינו, כל מי שמעוניין, ואנחנו רוצים לראות אתכם בעיניים שלנו, ולחבק אתכם ולהגיד לכם שעשיתם כמה שזה כואב להגיד דבר כזה, ועצוב. זה היה הדבר הכי נכון כנראה באותו רגע. אף אחד מאיתנו לא שופט אתכם ולא כועס, לא אני ולא בעלי רביב, לא הבת שלי נויה ולא יותם שבזיכרונו לברכה, ולא תובל אח שלי יותם. אוהבים אתכם מאוד מאוד, וזה הכל.
In a June 2020 New York Times article, Aileen Zimmerman writes the following: resilience is the ability to recover from difficult experiences and setbacks, to adapt, move forward, and sometimes even experience growth. You can think of resilience as a set of skills that can be and often is learned. How we cope depends on what is in our resilience toolbox. The tools common to a resilient people are optimism, a moral compass, religious or spiritual beliefs, cognitive and emotional flexibility, and social connectedness. Now, there is much I don't know. I don't know how this unbelievable mother found the strength to say what she said. I do not know how through her pain she not only managed to stand up and draw a breath, but was able to help us all rise up and breathe alongside her. I also don't know if I agree with the fact that resilience is simply the ability to adapt and overcome. In my mind, it is actually our ability to begin a process. It's not only a need to move forward, but an attempt at taking a first step off the mountain, a first step towards realizing that the ram in the thicket won't be enough, a first step towards recognizing that this knife has been born within us too many times, and any step is one towards a reality in which we remember who we are and who we aspire to be. If this is true, resilience is being able to stand up to support our brave soldiers, as well as calling out, praying with our feet, demanding our government do more for the release of loved ones, friends, families, those we know and those we don't, held in captivity for 406 days. The Hostage Family Forum, founded by volunteers within hours of 6/29, October 7th, stands at the forefront of ensuring the release of the infant to the elderly, the soldiers and the civilians, the women and the men. Standing in the streets of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Kiryat Gat, the Western Negev, and elsewhere around the country, Israelis show up again and again to embrace all of the families who are waiting, praying, and taking action, as well as challenging our leadership to do better, and if they can't, to step aside. This process is one of transformation. We have witnessed what has happened, and now we must act. We must do. We must put one foot in front of the other. This is resilience. As I mentioned, this is a painful, difficult, and unprecedented reality. Our attempt to stand again won't be before we continue to fight for our lives, protect our family, and ensure that we win this war. I hear myself and I sound as if I'm speaking to you on October 8th, 2023. Today's date is October 406th. Every day the fight continues. This also includes our internal struggle as well. The unity that filled all space has begun to fray at the edges, maybe to be expected as we are as diverse a society that exists in the world. The discontent that is felt in the streets and the tension felt within society is never about whether we have a right to exist. It is about how we exist, how we move forward, how we rise up, and what we choose to have in our hearts. We demand of our leaders that they are worthy of all of us. We have no choice but to be victorious on this front as well. Only then will we be able to mourn our fallen heroes, our children, our parents, and ourselves. And then we will have to rebuild. The foundations of that rebirth will be the commitment, the dedication, the determination, and the bravery of our soldiers and of our civilians during this very challenging time. The women and men who continue to give their lives to save their comrades, to save their families. We saw those who looked left and right, saw no one else, and stepped forward to hold off hundreds of terrorists and help the rest of us rise again. We are a nation that has been backed up against a wall, led by a generation of young people, and not so young, who have placed themselves between the enemy and their country. This includes the bravery of parents who literally laid upon their children to save them, and those who continue to breathe so that their children will continue to do so as well. For more than a year, we have fallen into an abyss. We have been searching for the ram, and we have found the knife that Uri speaks of. We have temporarily lost the ability to utter the quintessential Israelism, Yeh beseder, it'll be okay. Not because we think it won't, it will be, because there is no middle ground. We have no other choice. We simply have not yet found the clear path that will get us there. But as our biblical narrative lays out for us throughout the trajectory of 4,000 years of Jewish history and Jewish memory, we have an innate ability to climb out of the pitfalls and reach great heights, reminding ourselves again and again who we are and that we know how to create a society that we are worthy of. And yet, adding to the layers of what I don't know if this is simply optimism on my part. According to the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in Dignity of Difference, How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations, one of the most important distinctions I have learned in the course of reflection on Jewish history, he says, is the difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hope is the belief that together we can make things better. Optimism is a passive virtue. Hope is an active one. It takes no courage to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to have hope. Knowing what we do of our past, no Jew can be an optimist. But Jews have never, despite a history of sometimes awesome suffering, given up hope. What you're about to hear is an excerpt from the funeral of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, with a few of the words shared by his father, John.
Hirsch's friends, former campers, people he met at various music festivals, and so many more across nationalities, religions, and ages have reached out to us to tell us, of course, they always had a great time hanging out with Hirsch, but they also thoroughly enjoyed real, meaningful conversations with him in which he stretched their thinking. Just a few of the topics that Hirsch has challenged us on in recent years include the ethics of eating animals, the pros and cons of nation states, Israeli settlement policy, halachic observance, the value of a university degree, consumer consumption, and so much more. Always seeking to understand the other, and always with dignity and respect. One of the most fitting posts I saw about Hirsch yesterday was the one that said, Yehi Zichro Mahapecha, may his memory be a revolution. The most common word that I've received from people, thousands of messages, is Slicha, I'm sorry. Hirsch, we failed you. We all failed you. You would not have failed you. You would have pushed harder for justice. You would have worked to understand the other, to bridge differences. You would have challenged more people to challenge their own thinking. And what you would be pushing for now is to ensure that your death, the deaths of all the soldiers, and so many innocent civilians are not lishav, not in vain. Your starting point would be returning all of the hostages. For 330 days, Mama and I sought the proverbial stone that we could turn over to save you. Maybe, just maybe, your death is the stone, the fuel that will bring home the remaining 101 hostages. Od lo avda tikvatenu.
Hope is what generates action. Action is the process of resilience. Resilience is what will allow us to take a step forward. Stand up, draw a deep breath, and once again reflect the ideal of Am Yisrael. That's who we are, and that's who we'll be again. From the pits out of which we climb individually and as a nation, we will reach a juncture, reflect, and realize that we have blossomed into who we strive to be. With our back up against the wall, we have no other choice. Shabbat Shalom.